There was once a time in my life when I would always fantasize about being the last person on Earth. Not for a long time, just a week or so. Not so long that I would have to worry about survival, but not so short that I can't experience anything. I would picture myself checking out places I couldn't go to before, or even better, places that were usually filled with people. The busy streets in the middle of the afternoon lay vacant, and I imagined using them as my own personal sidewalk. I'd walk through previously busy airports and see absolutely nobody in sight. I'd go to schools and take tours around the hallways, ordinarily packed with people, but remain empty. I was fascinated with this thought as a kid, and for the longest time I'd sneak away from after-school programs, school dances, or any other excuse I had to be in school after classes had ended, just to get that feeling of being the last person on Earth. Exploring these places felt odd, like reality itself was altered, like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, observing a setting never meant to be seen by anyone. And for the most part, I wasn't meant to see this. Whenever I had interactions with the school hallway, it was always supposed to be with the company of others. And if not, at the very least I would hear somebody in a classroom, but here, I was defenseless. Time would seem to slow down. I would forget whatever assignments I had to do and just observe my surroundings. Then I would always get this feeling, imagining myself walking down those empty streets. Being happy I was living my dream, yes, but also a tad bit unsettled. These streets aren't meant for me. They are meant for cars driven by people. When those people no longer exist, it feels as though a ghost is present. I could explore a mall for hours in wonder with nobody to stop me. Yet there would always be a presence, not of people but of the environment itself. The people stopped being the focal point of my decision to go to the airport. The places I wanted to visit on an airplane were not the reason for my presence. I went there for the airport itself. This environment that would previously be nothing but a point of transition between where you are and where you're going. A place that most people would agree is pretty annoying to go to on your way to a much better destination was suddenly the point of my visit. I would imagine walking down the runways, the halls, the private areas and see nobody and hear nothing but my own footsteps echoing through an artificial landscape rich with absolutely no one. Is it weird to enjoy this? Is it weird that I fantasized about this as a kid? No, because the internet in the past few years has been infatuated with the same phenomenon. You could argue that me wanting to be present in a place of transition all alone was sparked by an interest in a phenomenon known as liminal spaces. The desire for everyone to disappear just for a little while is something most of us have thought about at one point or another. There have been many videos going over the topic of humanity ending without you. Discussion about being the last human being on Earth tends to revolve more around the survival aspect, which is fine, it makes sense actually, but nobody ever talks about the melancholia of being in a world left behind. I'd imagine if I was in that situation, I would spend a lot of my time exploring. I get the feeling this world was once filled with life, exhibitions and museums pouring with personality, the bedrooms of people still rife with the lives of the humans that once inhabited them. Works of art, movies, buildings in progress will remain unfinished for the rest of time. This idea that humanity will go out not with a bang, but with a quiet whimper, and you are the final person to see this subtle rapture, isn't a fictitious one. Minecraft is a game we've all played. I'm sure the majority of us have spent hours poring over builds, designing mob farms, playing multiplayer on random servers. Those old servers always felt a bit unsettling, didn't they? And I don't mean the popular ones either. I mean the ones you would just see and join, only to find nobody on. As a kid, I would spend a lot of my time playing Minecraft joining random servers I'd find online. One time I distinctly remember joining a public SMP server that had been long past its prime. The video I had gotten it from was probably years old. Nobody was online. I explored this dead world by my lonesome. Every once in a while on my travels I'd come across someone's base, maybe a small house or a massive complex. I'd find indentations in mountains where years before some player must have dug out and spent the night. But that's all gone now. These people and the times they had here, the things they built, the places they planned, have all been lost to time for years. There are other examples of this in the digital world that take this to the extreme. 2B2T, the oldest anarchy server in Minecraft, is the closest digital version of a societal culture we have to date. The concept of everybody having hacked clients, giving people the ability to basically do and destroy whatever they want, is one that is very much in line with the feeling I got exploring these old servers. Great cities, dilapidated ruins, chaos and disorder as far as the eye can see. You have to walk tens of thousands of blocks away from spawn just to reach normal-looking Minecraft terrain. Yet, in this world of disarray, very rarely I'd find a place untouched. Maybe it was a shack in the woods, a funny sign, or a large structure made from obsidian so it couldn't be easily blown up. Somehow, finding order amidst the chaos felt so human. A house in the middle of a lush forest is an image that is a lot more powerful when nothing else in this world is orderly. A lot of the places on this server don't even feel like they have a purpose. It really felt like I was the last one alive in a dead world. A world completely lacking order. The occasional human-made structure untouched held more personality than any office building could ever hope to. Around 3 years ago, I played on another Minecraft SMP. This time I was interwoven with the community and we had a lot of fun. At one point I built a house, then some other people joined and we founded a town called Pittsburgh named after one of our friends. After a while, basically the entire active player base was living there. Recently, for a different video, I decided to revisit that world file and went back to that little town. Now, I'm not one to get nostalgic. I don't usually have the thought that the past was much better than the present, but when I explored this town, it gave me a sense of longing to go back. I felt so many emotions, nostalgia with a hint of sadness, but also a fair bit of surprise. I was surprised at how much I did not remember. I would often find myself thinking, this was a huge part of my experience here, how could I forget that? I was shocked at my ignorance of a time I claimed to remember well. A dogfight game I created with another member, the big boat race we had near the end of the season, or the assassin type game I made with a friend that I had completely forgotten about. I couldn't shake the feeling that all of this had just been lying here, remembered by nobody. Chests filled with objects that haven't been touched in years, buildings that me and my friends started and never got around to finishing before the season ended. I walked into an old saloon and heard the bark of a dog that had been sitting on a chair for nearly half a decade. More than anything, however, this made me wonder, what else have I forgotten? I only learned where my small town even was through a screenshot of the coordinates I had found from some old footage. What other places have I forgotten? Was there anything else I did that I simply don't remember? And this lack of memory also made the places I did know about somewhat unsettling. After exploring for a while longer, I realized I've completely forgotten the reason a lot of these places were even built. Sure, some are obvious, like the various houses we had, but what was this unfinished building going to be used for? What was the function of this small shelter in the snowy mountains? This lack of context made these structures uncanny, places that not only no longer serve function to anybody, but the reason they were even built remains a complete mystery. A farmhouse without furniture becomes uncanny, an underground room devoid of any blocks other than the ones that make it up becomes alien. What was any of this doing here? I had forgotten the very function of these places when once they were filled with life. This stage used to be the place me and my online friends would come to hang out, sing songs, and do whatever really. And now a ghost remains. This was all in the past. Now it's just a stage. Its time as a functional place has ceased and it is now a time capsule of what once was. If a future Minecraft archaeologist unearthed our little stage, they wouldn't think twice about it. I looked at a lot of the buildings here in a similar light. These locations ripped out of context by years of aging and a global lack of recollection. Me and my friends only passed by these places and failed to see how much they really meant to us. It was only after coming back years later with a fresh perspective that I realized how underappreciated the buildings we had all of our fun in were. Our lives had came and went in these places, and we were too preoccupied to notice. We treated these spots as if they were a hallway, not meant to be focused on, and only characterized by the activities we were starting and finishing. Or a hotel, only distinguished by where you're coming from and where you're going. Or a highway, used only as a place of transition and isn't designed as an actual place. The feeling you get from these places that aren't really places are what many have defined as liminality. And this feeling is often the one associated with liminal spaces. Now I realize I went on that entire tangent about Minecraft without actually defining what a liminal space is, but I think you mostly get it from that description. These places left behind are liminal spaces. These places we never appreciated, these places of transience, these places that were forgotten, are all examples of liminal spaces. But in real life, they are places that don't concern themselves with identity. Places with no history, only serving the thousands that pass through them every day. A hallway is a liminal space because it's the means between two ends. A hallway isn't a place. Sure, you need people to design it, places for it to connect to, and people can make the hallway have a personality with pictures and drawings. But it still isn't really a place. A hallway is never anybody's destination. A hallway is only defined by the place you go and the place you're coming from. It isn't exactly its own thing. Take a mirror as an example. A mirror is nothing more than the thing it reflects. Characterizing a hallway is like characterizing a mirror. While yes, it is an object, it doesn't really have the same qualities of a thing, because a mirror changes depending on who's using it. The same thing can be said for places of transition such as a hallway, defined only by where you start and where you will end. But of course, not all liminal space photographs depict hallways. There are plenty of liminal spaces that depict gas stations, hotels, and airports. But as we will come to find, none of these places are really places either. The main theme between all three of these locations is their lack of destination. I don't go to a hotel just to visit, and I don't go to an airport if I don't have a flight to catch. This phenomenon is highlighted well in the French anthropologist Marc Hoget's book, Non-Places: An Introduction to Supermodernity. Non-places are Hoget's term for generic places such as bus stops, train stations, or airports, while no matter how grandiose and pretty looking, don't convey a sense of place. While regular places are typically relational, historical, and concerned with identity, non-places lack these fundamental characteristics. As the Oxford Reference states, non-places are designed and intended for the frictionless passage of a nameless and faceless multitude. We are always moving in a non-place, either entering, moving through, or exiting, never dwelling. When one gets the unique opportunity to dwell within a non-place, say your flight getting cancelled causing you to stay overnight at the airport, it is then that we get a sense of liminality. In a way, we can almost treat this experience as a purgatory of sorts. You're not home awaiting your flight, and you're also not on the flight, nor are you moving through the airport to get to your flight. You are now in a state that most pieces of media, whether it be book, film, or video game, would cut away from. You are now dwelling in transience, at an unfamiliar time of day given your location with mostly no people around. But there's a flaw in thinking that non-places are a synonym for liminal spaces. We can all agree that this image is a liminal space, but this image isn't. Why is that? It meets the first criteria we've established, yet it doesn't impart the same feeling as the first image. This leads us into the second criterion. Context matters. It's not enough for these images just to be transitional, that's only a part of it. These images must also lack context. A hallway in the day with people walking through is a non-place by definition, sure, however it is not automatically a liminal space. But if you, say, take out different aspects that give it life, like the people that walk through it, or set it in a different time of day that would be unexpected for a school hallway to be viewed, well then you have yourself a liminal space. As mentioned previously, these places of transition are defined by the people using them, and when these people are not present, we become confused. And we start to subconsciously ask questions. Why aren't there people here? Why is it nighttime? What am I doing here if I have nowhere to go? These questions cannot be easily answered, therefore a primal fear is present when looking at these images. So that's what liminal spaces are then. Places that aren't really places. Places of transition that aren't meant to be looked at twice. And when you choose to look at them and treat them like a destination by focusing on them, they become uncanny. Ripping away context such as no people being present or a change in the time of day is also essential in creating a good liminal space. This might seem pretty straightforward, but I'm not 100% satisfied with this definition, because it doesn't explain the vast majority of liminal space images that don't fit into these categories. These two sole criteria also extend to many other images that would technically be considered liminal spaces if this was all we were considering in our definition. Yet these images do not impart the same feeling liminal spaces do. Why is that? Well, unlike what the very definition of liminal might have you think, liminal spaces are not only transitional spaces. Look at this image of a kid's pool. This isn't at all transitional, in fact this is a destination. You would go to a pool. However, the context is ripped away. Sure, it might not be uncommon to be the only one in a pool, but if this pool is completely empty, then that must mean it's nighttime. Again, a context this pool was not meant to be seen in by most people. So the notion that liminal space is a synonym for transitional space is wrong. Context is also not required sometimes either. Look at this image of the Mont Saint-Michel in France. There really isn't anything wrong with this image. It isn't a transitional space. I suppose you could argue that the castle in the distance is the destination and wherever you are would technically be a transition point, but I don't think this is the case, simply because where you are isn't artificial. This is just nature. Sure, a trail up to a fire lookout tower is technically a transitional space. You wouldn't call it a liminal space because it doesn't depict the modernity of our world. Also, there's no removed context. This is just a field with some sheep. There's inherently nothing liminal about it if we use our current definition, yet most of us would agree that this is a liminal space. You can see why attempting to put a one-size-fits-all definition of what constitutes a liminal space is very challenging. So instead of trying to define liminal spaces, I'd instead like to categorize them into different kinds of liminal spaces that all give the liminal feeling but are different enough that they require some degree of separation. These 4 different liminal spaces generally incorporate 95% of liminal space images, but are different enough that they require some degree of separation from one another. These 4 generally incorporate 95% of liminal space images. 1. Transitional spaces. While not synonymous with liminal spaces as mentioned previously, places of transition, such as hallways, tend to be very liminal. This is the classic liminal space that most definitions end up stuck with, which makes sense. It follows the term liminality as coined by Victor Turner in the late 1960s as a state between states, and is the most direct ancestor of Marc Auger's non-places. This is usually the most common type of liminal space image, but we've already gone over this, so I won't dwell on it for too long. Get it? Because liminal spaces are places of transition you aren't supposed to dwell in. I'll shut up now. 2. Dreamlike/abstract liminal spaces. There is another category of liminal spaces I like to call dreamlike liminal spaces. And while yes, this is pushing the definition of a liminal space, considering that a lot of these weird liminal spaces tend to fall under the aesthetics of weirdcore or dreamcore, I still think we can all agree that the feeling is still present. Different characteristics of abstract liminal spaces include high saturation for a more otherworldly look, completely impossible locations or scenarios, such as these cars driving on an impossible highway around Earth in outdated 60s automobiles, or these pools that are both comforting and impossible, while being weirdcore inspired in a way. A lot of these abstract and dreamlike liminal spaces also tend to show certain characteristics of cursed images, with their nonsensical appearances and situations. The dreamlike aspects, of course, are also prevalent. A lot of people in various comment sections report seeing these places in their dreams. Hell, while looking through a video titled "Places You've Seen in Your Dreams" by Z1MR1, I saw an image that genuinely made me jump out of my seat in complete shock, because I had recalled seeing this exact thing before in a lucid dream. I'm not making this up, I have an entire page of my old dream journal describing this exact place. So when people say they've seen these places before, I understand what they mean. Looking back on it, it probably is just a similar looking place and not exactly the same. I mean, a dilapidated building isn't too uncommon of a setting, but it's still hard to deny that some people feel like these places were taken directly from their dreams. And it's hard to blame them considering it does feel like that sometimes. If not directly, a lot of these images feel familiar enough that they could be distant memories, but just unfamiliar enough for some ambiguity. A middle ground between recollection of the real world and complete fabrication. Dreams act as the liminal space of our memories, so it's no wonder we put liminal spaces and dreams into a similar category. 3. Nostalgic liminal spaces. Nostalgia is one of the most important aspects of a liminal space, yet it is nowhere to be found in any definition of the word liminal. Even the r/liminal space subreddit has a hard time accepting the status of purely nostalgic liminal space images. Yet again though, instead of having a strict set of rules set in stone for what a liminal space can be, we must instead look at the universal feeling all of these provide and base our categorization on that. The aesthetics of old video games are often shown as one of the main examples of a nostalgic liminal space. Games like Minecraft, while not being too old, are special because they have a history of imparting nostalgia to those who played it in its early versions. It's also the kind of liminal space I found so captivating searching around my Minecraft town. Nostalgic liminal spaces feel like all of your childhood memories smushed together into one giant lack of recollection. 4. Scary liminal spaces. Maybe not the exact word for it, but there is a category of liminal spaces that are more unsettling than usual, usually depicting dark areas or flipping your nostalgia on its head. These are just the 4 main liminal space categories. Of course, there are many hundreds of subcategories on top of subcategories, but these are the main ones. None of this is to say that these categories are all completely distinct from one another. They're not. In fact, it's decidedly more difficult to find an image that contains only one of these categories than an image that contains all three. You'll often find combinations of these three characteristics everywhere. So now we have a pretty basic understanding of what a liminal space is. Based on my own definition, liminal spaces are places that can be either transitional, abstract, nostalgic, or a combination of all of them. These spaces mustn't have people. And optionally, but importantly, they must be taken out of their design context. In more uncommon circumstances, this doesn't seem to be necessary. These spaces can also be scary or comforting depending on the intent of the photographer/editor. This is, in my opinion, a very solid definition that includes mostly everything we would call a liminal space. That is again to say, you don't have to check off all these boxes in order for something to be liminal. Again, liminality is defined by a feeling. You don't ever have to look at a liminal space, inspect every corner of the image just to make sure it meets the criteria I set in my definition. You really just know when you're looking at a liminal space image. An interesting thought experiment would be to try to explain a liminal space to someone who's never seen one before. I'd wager you'd have a very hard time. Sure, you can describe a liminal space with a million words. Every intricate detail, every subcategory, every pixel of every nostalgic Minecraft screenshot. But to a blind person, or somebody who has never seen a liminal space image, it won't make a difference. They will never get that feeling that looking at a liminal space image provides, only further proving that it is literally impossible to put a definition on these images. We've all heard of the Mandela effect, right? The spooky global misrecollection of a moment in time. Some common examples being Pikachu's never having existed black spot on its tail, the Fruit of the Loom logo never having a cornucopia, whatever. Most people have been fooled by this odd phenomenon. Everyone has one particular fact that's the most shocking to them. The Pikachu one in particular caught me off guard when I first heard about it. But perhaps my favorite example of the Mandela effect is one that has happened in my own comment section. Have a look at this image. I bet I made some of you jump. I must have, because every time I show this image of a wooden playground in a video, I get bombarded with quite literally hundreds of comments, claiming this was the exact wooden park they grew up playing in. Let me get one thing straight with the hundreds of commenters that say this was the wooden playground they grew up with. It wasn't. I can promise you that. First of all, we can easily disprove this via the people who put specific locations for this wooden playground that don't match each other. But secondly, I think there is an easy explanation as to why so many people seemingly recall this exact playground. I also happen to have regularly visited a wooden park that looked exactly like this. Hell, even I had to do a double take and make sure this wasn't the wooden park that I grew up in. I didn't, of course. Yet I still hang on this strange conviction that yes, I did visit this playground and it is in fact the one I always went to. It seems a good portion of people think the same. I assume this global misunderstanding of a very common playground design stems from the fact that we don't remember the finer details of these places. As Winnie the Pooh famously said, "We didn't realize we were making memories, we just knew we were having fun." These people trust their childhood selves to remember that yes, this specific wooden playground was the exact one they grew up with. Much like me thinking I knew the ins and outs of that old Minecraft town when in reality I didn't, so too do these people think they know enough about their childhoods to assume such a place was theirs. This phenomenon of a false global recollection of this specific playground everyone claims to have played on as a child and spams my comment section with has a much more logical and obvious answer. This design is very common. There are probably thousands of wooden playgrounds that look similar all around the world. We seem to be blurring thousands of childhood memories together to come up with a picture that might look something like this in our heads. So when we then see that image on screen, we freak out because yeah, that's the one. In this way, we all seem to have a hive mind of nostalgia. The face of nostalgia has changed. Your childhood was a long time ago. How could you remember every detail, everything you did? The answer is you can't. So you end up relating to a childhood that nobody really had, but everyone thinks they had. Why is all of our childhood nostalgia so similar? It's like those videos you sometimes see of things we all did as kids. Oh, we all used to pour shots in our bottle caps and drink them, or attempt to catch the fridge light turning off. I never was able to do that. Anyway, how come we've all done these seemingly very specific things? Going to the comment section of these videos, you'll find a good number of people genuinely confused as to how we all practically lived the same childhood. Liminality is really just a version of this in physical space. Of course, we haven't all been to this wooden park. We are grouping together memories of older times and making them so non-specific that we get nostalgic for places we never even knew. A childhood home is yours, it's exclusive to you, but the faded memories of playgrounds, school hallways, or wooden parks isn't exclusive to anyone. These are not your memories. These are everyone's memories. We can go even further than just space. Anemoia, as defined by the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, refers to a nostalgia for a time you've never known. I didn't grow up in the 90s, yet the aesthetics of that time still fit well into the nostalgic liminal space category, despite seemingly not appealing to everyone. Yet even for people like me who didn't grow up in these times, the feeling of liminality is still present in an image depicting the 90s, the 80s, and even the 60s. It makes you wonder what people from other time periods would consider liminal spaces. An old, decayed 1860s saloon with no people in the dead of night, while just a decrepit building from a bygone era for us, might just have been an altered reality for someone who grew up in the days of the old American frontier. Liminal space images with dates on them are also particularly nostalgic. Not only do they depict a time long in the past, they also directly tell you. There's something different about these images knowing they're from 2002, like a piece of history not meant to be touched. They can also contribute to an uncanny feeling by being set in the future, like we're seeing times we shouldn't. Despite all this nostalgia though, liminal spaces don't come without a certain fear, or at the very least discomfort. This isn't true for all images. Some liminal spaces can be very comforting. The pool rooms are an example of what most people would call a comforting liminal space. Created by Jared Pike, the pool rooms appear relaxing. I can relate to these images, so much so that I feel comfort inside of them. I feel as though I can place myself in here. I can feel the lukewarm water, the sounds of splashing as I slowly move through it, the smooth tiles contrasting with the more coarse in-betweens under my feet. Unlike most liminal spaces, when I place myself in this image, I feel nothing but calm. Feels like I can lay down on that familiar tiling and just become one with the space itself. This place is undoubtedly a liminal space, but it's one that you dwell in. It is here I would like to make the distinction between dwelling and active survival. We dwell in our homes, we dwell at work, we dwell in places that are familiar, that pose no threats. And similarly, I would dwell in a place like this, as long as there were no entities or anything obviously scary. This cannot be said about the majority of liminal space images. For every comforting place of dwelling, there's a place of active survival, an impending doom feeling some of these images can convey. What these scary liminal spaces can do is take something familiar to you and put them in an unfamiliar, scary context. This feeling has often been called the uncanny, and these images can be palpably uncanny. The uncanny is a concept deeply rooted in psychology. The term comes from the German word unheimlich, which literally translates to unhomely. In other words, unfamiliar. It was first introduced by German psychiatrist Ernst Jentsch, and later elaborated on by Sigmund Freud in his 1919 essay titled The Uncanny. The strange thing about the word unheimlich is that it not only means not of home, but also can be used in certain circumstances to describe something hidden within the home that was never meant to come to light. This is contradictory, and would suggest that the meaning of the words unheimlich, uncanny, and heimlich, canny, overlap. And if unheimlich is unfamiliar, then naturally heimlich would mean familiar. We can then assume that the uncanny is not solely defined by the unsettling nature of unfamiliarity, but also familiar things becoming unfamiliar. This is also in line with the second definition of unheimlich as being something from within the home that was never meant to come to light. Look at an image of a more creepy, or in this case uncanny, liminal space. We are in a familiar environment, one that, for a period of time, we would be in nearly every day during the morning and afternoon, looked at through the lens of unfamiliarity. We see this place we're used to seeing during the day at night, something within the boundaries of what we would call familiar that was never meant to be seen by us is coming to light. The secondary definition of unheimlich. In other words, the familiar is becoming unfamiliar. We make the childish and unconscious assumption that if a thing has consistently been found to possess a certain quality, Even if that quality should be lost at any later date, it must have that quality forever and can always have it. If we dwell in a classroom during the day enough, we start to make a mental model of what these places should look like. We seem to save these memories of that place into a snapshot of what we know, when reality is a video that is constantly changing. This is all to say that we compare that snapshot of a familiar environment to that same environment in an unfamiliar context, like a classroom at night. When they don't match our preconceived notions of what they should look like, we become surprised. But this seems obvious. We consciously understand that a classroom undergoes the same changes of night and day as anything else would, yet we seem to always be shocked when these changes are laid out for us. Freud thought that nobody was truly free from their childish views of the world. Sure, as we grow older, we adopt new beliefs and generally prefer to reject the ones we made in our adolescent minds. As children, we might be tempted in believing that these places stay the same as when we first see them, that the qualities of our first impressions of these places stick around forever, but our rational, more grown-up brains know this is obviously not true. While we consciously understand that this emptiness in a different time of day is to be expected, to a more childish part of us, we see this as wrong, as a threat to what we believe in. But these thoughts are buried so deep that we are only left with a subtle feeling of discomfort. To quote Freud himself, "Nowadays we no longer believe in them," in reference to our old ways of thinking. We have surmounted such ways of thought, but we do not feel quite sure of our new set of beliefs, and the old ones still exist within us, ready to seize upon any confirmation. I feel like liminal space images are this subtle confirmation that our primitive ways of thinking are all still within us. Why are we unsettled by a grocery store at night? A phenomenon that is entirely explainable using the logic we know now and isn't at all mysterious. Probably because as children we would not think this situation was even possible. This could be one reason the themes of ignorance in childhood are so prevalent in creepy liminal spaces and in the horror genre in general. As kids, we are much more prone to fall for these tricks, and we do not have an easy explanation for this phenomenon we deem as foreign. Liminal spaces are a look back into that time, and a chance for that small percentage of us that still operates on that childlike way of thinking to once again be used to determine the world. This all falls apart, however, when one decides to put a monster somewhere. Some active threat that even our rational brains are afraid of. I don't consider these places that feature an entity a liminal space, because instead of asking the questions, why is nobody here? Why is this place that should be filled with people lacking them? We ask, if I'm in a place that should not be filled with people because of the context, then why is somebody here? And this really is just the definition of horror. A lot of horror games can be dumbed down to a monster in a place monster shouldn't be, a monster in a forest, a monster in a school, a monster in a pizzeria. It is only when we add a centralized threat that we no longer become somewhat fearful for a reason unknown, but instead very fearful for a reason that is obvious. It is the feeling of terror that I find a lot more fascinating than the feeling of horror, and one that liminal spaces exemplify. Terror is the feeling of dread and anticipation that comes before the horrifying experience. Liminal spaces are the embodiment of terror. However, liminal spaces are eternal. We are in a constant state of terror looking at a liminal space photograph. But unlike a film or a video game, this terror is never followed up by anything. When we look at these images, we metaphorically brace for impact. Yet there's never any horror present, simply the dread and anticipation of something, anything happening. But nothing ever happens. If you're confused as to why you even feel this way, what's wrong with this place? It's just a gas station, just a hallway. What about this is so terrifying that I expect something to jump out at me? In fact, I want something to jump out at me, just to give me a justification for my fears. But it never comes, just a perpetual state of anticipation. And it's why I think the backrooms are such a terrifying idea. For those who don't know, I'll try to summarize the concept of the backrooms briefly. The backrooms are a creepypasta originating from a 4chan post, a place of infinite corridors and hallways, all mono yellow with buzzing fluorescent lighting. Just that raw idea of being put in a place completely foreign yet somewhat familiar. Repeating hallways that go on for eternity, the buzzing of old fluorescent lighting. You would think that something would try to chase you, or you're in some sort of danger. But in the backrooms, at least in the original concept, nothing is present. The only horror is the human brain driving itself crazy in the madness of mono yellow. But of course, now that the backrooms have gotten popular, people have added new levels to it and a bunch of lore, including new entities, which is cool, I guess. I've already talked on how I feel about the original concept of the backrooms versus the new version, so I won't go in too deep. The concept of a monster/entity being present is alluded to in the original post, but never truly stated. I personally think this only adds to the paranoia that something might be here, rather than an actual threat being present. But much like scary liminal space images, you are in a perpetual state of anxiety and anticipation in the backrooms. It is pure terror. As Christopher Isherwood once said, horror is always aware of its cause, terror never is. That is precisely what makes terror terrifying. Liminal spaces are also a weird temporal phenomenon. We never usually think of time as anything but moving forward, but liminal spaces force us to question this built-in idea. When you look at a liminal space image, you are at a transitioning point. It feels as though, much like the hallways liminal space photos often depict, that we are in an in-between. I can't help but get the feeling when looking at these photos that the past has already happened and the future is yet to occur, leaving me alone in the present. I first thought this on a bike ride I was on. I was going through an old dirt road when I decided to turn and bike in the other direction. I emerged at a hill, and when I looked over, I found myself viewing a neighborhood. Now, I had no idea where I was at the time or what this place even was. One minute I was on an old dirt trail and the next I was looking at infrastructure. Everything seemed so perfect in that quaint little neighborhood. Almost too perfect. You know the classic American suburban home design? This neighborhood was like that. But it seemed particularly off. Not a cloud in the sky, the homes all looked identical, cars only sparsely seen, and not a single person on the road. When I went over to it, I couldn't shake this uncanny feeling. If time itself and everyone in it had left me behind and I was the only one existing in this infinite present, I wouldn't even notice in a place like this. Hell, without enough context clues, how could I know how far this place goes on? In the narrow view of a photo of this place, no exit would be visible. Therefore, creating an out for myself in this image is much harder. We began to subconsciously think about this place as being never-ending. We see nothing beyond the horizon except more of the same, more houses, more infinite suburbia. And when we place ourselves here suspended in time, we not only fail to find an out for ourselves in the temporal sense, but also in the physical sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how long I walked along these houses, I would never reach an end. Time and space existing as one thing, keeping me trapped here forever. I think we can look at a lot of these images like that. This phenomenon can happen during the day, like my example with the neighborhood, but I think it's important to explore such a strange feeling at a time of day that creates the most liminal spaces, the night. I think the dark is one of the most essential parts of creating a creepy liminal space. Of course we have reasons to be afraid of the dark. Hell, I made an entire video about it. But it almost feels different in the context of liminal spaces. The dark exudes terror and the inability to see an incoming threat. So it isn't surprising that nighttime is one of the biggest factors in creating this altered reality feel we see in liminal spaces. It's one of the easiest ways to rip familiarity away from a familiar space, taking a place seen one time of day and contrasting it with the opposite. Imagine for a second you're in a school at night, say 3 in the morning. It is at this time of night nobody is present in school. No faculty or staff would ever have a reason to be in school at this hour. These once familiar halls now completely alien. But it isn't just the school that's empty. At this hour, the surrounding streets are likely empty. Everyone is in their homes. It's possible that the nearest person that isn't in their home is half a mile away. The silence is so prevalent, you can hear your own ears ringing. Our time as a person is characterized by other people, and when literally nothing is going on and nobody is around, we feel a sense that we are trapped. You get the feeling that everybody's gone. When I look at these images of schools at night, malls at night, empty streets at night, I get that same feeling. I get the feeling of an infinite present, that no matter how much I walk, nothing will change, and the passage of time has left me here to rot, and it is here I will stay for all eternity. Then something occurred to me. Sure, I get this feeling from liminal images at night, but I've never actually tried to be present in these images. I've never gone outside very late at night, at least not alone or outside of a car. And the times I would leave the house at 2 or 3 a.m. with someone else was usually in a car on the way to the airport. And even these times felt alien. Why would I go out alone without a car, without people? There's no reason to. So for the sake of new experiences, I tried to. These were the results. As expected, it was very lonely. I would always find myself being the only one on the street. Everything was closed, not a car on the road or a pedestrian on the sidewalk. My usual route that I bike every day being made so foreign that it was completely unrecognizable. This was the closest I'd get in real life to being the last person on Earth. Nobody is here to remember anything. In this reality of past, present, and future all existing simultaneously, it feels like nothing can happen. It's like memory is different here. Like if the world suddenly swallowed me whole, nobody would notice. This is the land of forgotten memories. When we forget something, what happens to it? No, seriously, what happens to the memories that we forget when we can no longer recall a moment? There are scientific explanations. As we age, the size of the hippocampus, the part of the brain most responsible for keeping and storing memories, loses 5% of its neurons every decade, and some of our memories are destined to go along with it. Forgetting might not seem too serious at first. For most, it's an inconvenience. Forgetting where you left your phone, forgetting the name of someone you just met. Solar Sands once claimed in his video on thalassophobia,
but a far more likely, and still considerably unpleasant way to die, is drowning.
And that's fair. Drowning is a horrible death, but one death I think is even more tragic and far more common than drowning is dementia. This next section is a bit sad and talks about dementia, so if you want to skip past all that, here's the time code. In 2017, 3,500 to 4,000 people in the US drowned. 260,000 died from dementia. More people die from forgetting than from drowning. And the fate of dementia, I'd argue, is far worse than drowning. 24.7%, or a fourth of people aged 80 to 89 will develop dementia. It is a fate far worse than death, one where your cognitive abilities slowly begin to decline. You start by just forgetting basic common objects, until those common objects become foreign. Then you eventually lose yourself. Dementia isn't just forgetting where you placed a pencil or your address. Dementia is forgetting what a pencil is used for, forgetting where you are. Familiar things become unfamiliar, and soon you cannot communicate and don't recognize anything anymore. The now famous album Everywhere at the End of Time by Leland Kirby, better known as The Caretaker, is an album about dementia. More specifically, it is a 6.5-hour audio recreation of the experience of going through dementia. The album starts happy with ballroom music with slight crackles every once in a while. The crackles become more apparent until static and music are at equilibrium. The static soon takes over, until by the end, the music is gone. The tracks deteriorate into nothing but noise. There are 6 stages to the album, much like the 6 typical symptom-related stages of dementia, each one more haunting than the last. There is an image associated with each stage, starting with what appears to be a rolled-up magazine, and continuing with what looks to be a flower pot, but you can't quite make out what it's made of. Stage 3 onwards is complete abstraction. The second saddest stage image is image 4, where we get to see the outline of a person, but no details whatsoever, symbolizing not being able to remember or even recognize your loved ones. I say second saddest because the image of stage 6 is the most striking of all. A canvas. Not one that's blank, but instead turned around, symbolizing your memories still being intact, you just can't see them, like dementia taunting you in your final moments. This entire album is what I would classify as liminal space music. Ironically, some of the last memories of patients with dementia have been of music, which makes the decision to make a musical guide through dementia that much more ironic. Everywhere at the End of Time represents confusion and disorientation. Both dementia and liminal spaces share that aspect. You can draw a surprising number of parallels between the two. The loss of familiarity they both share, the familiar becoming unfamiliar. In a way, I would classify these liminal space images of old diners, malls long forgotten, and gas stations to be physical representations of dementia. In 70 years, when Gen Z becomes an old generation and some of us inevitably procure this horrible disease, these images of broad nostalgia, accompanied by the Caretaker's haunting music, might just be some of the last things we remember. Faded images of a bygone era, these places represent the fear of forgetting. These forgotten places we never had time to make mental models of at the time, but ironically might be some of the last things we ever remember. I mean, they seem perfect for it. Details so non-existent these images could apply to nearly anyone's childhood. Depictions so broad that anybody can relate to these places of the forgotten. In a way, it's a reflection of the human experience. Of us. We don't want to become homogenous with every other person that has ever existed. We want to stand out, become special, be famous and well known years after our passings. Yet, as the sands of time continue to shift, the majority fade into the obscurity of collective forgetfulness, their names lost to the public memory. You and I likely won't be remembered for very long. It's a depressing thought, but it's true. To demonstrate this, name 10 people from the 1500s. The majority of you probably can't. Though there were thousands of people from the 1500s that were notable, the public has mostly forgotten about them, just like the masses will likely forget us in the next 500 years. It's a sobering realization, one that beckons us to question the point of doing anything. What's the point of achieving anything? Why am I even making this video if in 500 years' time I will be irrelevant? Well, I can't answer that. We are all on our own journeys on this planet we call Earth, and nobody in the far future could possibly understand everything everyone has done. One may suppose in that way we find them relatable. Some people think they lead meaningless lives, that they live day by day. We all die, so why does this even matter? This is an incorrect approach in my opinion. As relatable as we can find them sometimes, we are not liminal spaces. We are people. Sure, you might not be remembered in a few hundred years, but the things you left behind certainly will. Like a rock being thrown into a lake producing a splash. Long after the stone sinks deep into the tranquil waters, the waves it makes continue outwards, long outliving the rock that created them. Your children, their children, the people you touch now, the influence you leave behind simply by the things you do. People in the future may watch these videos of mine, and in that way I might be immortal. Liminal spaces give me hope for a future that might forget who I was, but won't forget me. Our lives are not liminal spaces. They are not places of transition, they are destinations. You can look at life like a hallway you pass through, or you can look at it like a home you reside in. The choice is up to you. So go do something meaningful. Go prove to everyone and everything in this world that your life is not a transition point. You mean something. We all do. If you've ever felt down, like you just want to disappear, like you want the earth to just swallow you whole, just know this. Your life means much more than you could ever comprehend. And though we may wander through the liminal spaces of uncertainty and doubt, let us never forget the value of our own lives. Because in the end, it is our capacity for love, for compassion, and for connection that truly defines us. These places are transitional, pointless, and forgettable in the grand scheme of things. Your life isn't. So go enjoy it, because this life isn't something you just pass through. For in the end, it is not the fleeting moments of transition that define us, but the enduring legacy of our actions and the unmistakable mark we leave upon the world.